Night pressed heavily against the fortress of Tordesillas, drowning the ramparts in a darkness so complete it seemed to seep into the stone itself. The old walls did not sleep. They listened. They absorbed. They remembered. And tonight, as on so many nights before, they trembled. A single torch guttered in the corridor outside the queen's chamber, its flame bending away as though recoiling from something unseen. The guards stationed there shifted uneasily, hands tightening around their spears, eyes fixed forward but unfocused, bracing for a sound they prayed would not come. Came anyway, a muffled cry, thin, cracking, forced through clenched teeth, slipped from behind the heavy wooden door. It drifted down the hallway in a wavering line, too fragile to be a scream, too pained to be a whisper. The guards stiffened. Another cry followed, sharper this time, jagged at the edges. A sound that did not belong to a queen, but to a human being cornered inside her own failing body. Then the smell began to bleed into the corridor. At first it was subtle, like damp straw left too long in the cold. But it deepened quickly, curling beneath the guard's armor, clinging to the rough stone, dampening the air until every breath carried the same bitter truth. Something inside that room was breaking down. Something living. Something that should not be. A servant carrying linens stopped mid-step. Her face blanched. She took a single breath and choked on it, eyes watering, throat closing around a wave of nausea she could not conceal. She turned her head away, whispering under her breath with the fear of someone naming a curse. Her body is turning against her. The words hung in the air like frost. None of the guards corrected her. None of them dared. Beyond the door, another sound rose, soft, labored. A low moan dragged upward as if pulled by unseen hands. It vibrated through the hinges, through the stone, through the cold bones of the fortress itself. The corridor felt smaller with each passing second, tightening as the queen's suffering filled it, bending the night into something jagged and unnatural. Somewhere deeper in the fortress, a bell told the passing of another hour. But time no longer moved cleanly here. It thickened, slowed, twisted around the cries that seeped from the chamber. Every new breath, every shift of torchlight, every creak of aging would whisper the same unspoken dread. Inside that room, something was happening that no royal physician could explain, and no servant dared to witness. Before we begin, gently tap like, and tell echoes of time where in the world you're watching from. The woman suffering behind that door had once been a figure spoken of with reverence across an empire. Yet here, in this cold fortress far from courtly splendor, her name moved only in whispers, soft, cautious, as if spoken too loudly it might disturb whatever fragile thread held her to this world. She had been born into triumph, into destiny, into a dynasty that shaped continents. But none of that mattered now. In Tordesillas, she was not a queen adorned in jewels. She was not a political heir or a symbol of Spain's golden age. She was a shadow confined to a single chamber, a chamber that had become both sanctuary and tomb. The servants who crept through the halls carried stories in their eyes, stories they dared not speak aloud. They had seen her pacing for hours when her strength still allowed it, murmuring prayers into the silent dark. They had heard her calling out names long buried, reaching for voices that would never answer her. And they had watched, helpless, as her world shrank to the span of a few damp stones and a window too high for her to reach. Most days, the fortress itself felt like a living thing, watching her, swallowing her despair into its walls. Cold drafts slithered along the floors. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Shadows stretched a little too far, lingered a little too long. She had once stood in grand halls filled with banners and light. She had once been greeted by diplomats, scholars, nobles, people who bowed because they feared, respected, or desired the power she carried in her blood. But power had abandoned her now, or perhaps she had been abandoned by those who wielded it more ruthlessly. And so the queen remained unseen, unheard by the world beyond these walls, reduced to rumors, half-truths, and the uneasy glances of those assigned to watch over her. Her story, the real story, had been buried long before her body began to fail. And yet, in the trembling of her voice, in the restless shifting of guards outside her door, in the way the fortress seemed to hold its breath around her. There was the sense that something long hidden, something deliberately forgotten, was struggling to rise to the surface. If you're discovering this forgotten queen for the first time, consider subscribing to Echoes of Time for more buried histories. The fortress did not begin as a prison. It had once been a royal residence, an echo of grandeur perched above the river, its towers catching morning light like watchful sentinels. But time has a way of twisting places into reflections of the souls who inhabit them. And Tordesillas had twisted slowly, patiently, into something far colder. The queen's windows were shuttered long before her strength began to fade. Not by illness, not by fate, but by command. Heavy wooden panels locked out the sun, leaving only a dim, lifeless glow to seep through the cracks. Day and night blended into one unbroken dusk. The rhythm of life outside, bells, voices, markets, was reduced to distant murmurs that slipped through the stone like memories fading in a tired mind. Guards lined the corridors not as protectors, but as boundaries, unmovable, silent, trained to watch without reacting. They measured her world in steps. 10 from her bed to the far wall, 3 from the hearth to the door, none beyond the threshold. The boundaries never changed, only she did. The fortress air itself seemed altered by her confinement. Rooms once warmed by tapestries now breathed cold. Chambers built for ceremony echoed with nothing but the scrape of boots and the creak of aging beams. Even the gardens outside her walls grew wild and tangled, as though nature had chosen to mirror the unraveling happening within. Those who served her learned quickly to tread softly. Trays were placed down with careful hands. Whispers were exchanged far from her door. Every sound seemed amplified, as though the fortress were listening, storing each fragment of her isolation. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the queen would stand at her shuttered window and place her palm against the wood, as if searching for the warmth of the world she no longer touched. The servants watched from a distance, unable to comfort, unable to speak, caught between duty and pity. Here in these narrowing halls, time curled in on itself. The palace she had once walked with confidence had folded into a labyrinth of heavy doors and dim corridors, trapping her between memory and shadow. And in this place, this vast, echoing silence, a different kind of suffering began long before her body weakened. If you're still with me, drop a comment with your country. Echoes of Time loves seeing our global community. It began quietly, so quietly that those around her mistook it for exhaustion, or sorrow, or the weight of too many silent years. In a place where every whisper seemed exaggerated by the stone, the first warnings hid themselves in small, almost invisible changes. Some mornings, the queen rose later than usual, lingering in the dimness as though waiting for her strength to catch up with her breath. Other days, she pressed a hand to her side, steadying herself before taking the first step toward the wooden chair by the hearth. The servants watched from the doorway, uncertain whether they were witnessing a moment of weakness or simply another fragment of grief settling into her bones. She spoke less, moved less. A stillness began to grow around her. Not peaceful, but taut, like a thread stretched too far. At night, when the fortress quieted and the last footsteps faded, the guards sometimes heard her pacing softly within her chamber. Slow, uneven steps tracing the same worn path over and over, as though she were trying to outrun something unseen. Other nights she did not pace at all. She lay awake instead, her breathing shallow, her presence in the room felt more than heard. The attendants noticed the changes in her hands first, how they trembled when she reached for the cup of water they left at her bedside. They noticed it in her voice next, a faint strain beneath her words, as if every sentence took more from her than it should. They traded glances but said nothing. The walls of Tordesillas had a way of punishing those who spoke too freely. Within those walls, dread moved like a silent draft. Not the sharp kind that follows sudden illness, but the slow, creeping kind that takes hold over many months, settling into the corners where no physician was allowed to look. Her chamber grew heavier with each passing day, not from anything she did or said, but from the sense that something inside her had shifted, quietly and irrevocably. It was not madness, It was not rumor. It was something far more unsettling, because no one could name it. The queen herself felt it long before anyone else dared to admit it. There were moments when she fell still, listening to her own body with an expression caught between confusion and fear, as if she sensed a tide rising beneath her skin, a tide she could not hold back. Outside her door, the guards began to exchange watchful glances. Inside, the first shadow of a much darker night had already begun to form. Make sure to like the video so more history lovers can join our journey through echoes of time. The night it happened, the air inside Tordesillas felt unnaturally still. So still that even the torches along the corridors burned without flicker, their flames held upright as if awaiting a signal. Outside, the river pressed against its banks with a slow, restless murmuring, but within the fortress walls, no sound dared to rise, until hers did. It began as a low moan, barely audible beneath the weight of the stone, a sound that might have been mistaken for a dream echoing through sleep. But then it sharpened, thin, trembling, and stretched into a cry that pierced the corridor like a blade drawn across quiet. The guards snapped to attention, though none stepped forward. They exchanged glances, uncertain whether to move or stay rooted where fear held them. They had heard her cry out before, but never like this. There was something different in the sound tonight, something ragged, urgent, pulled straight from the depths of a body in revolt. Her voice rose again, louder now, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and unraveling down the hall. It hit the walls with such force that dust sifted down from the old beams above. One guard took a single step toward the door, stopped and swallowed hard. No order trained them for this. Inside the chamber, something had crossed an unseen threshold. The quiet suffering of previous months had broken open, and what remained was a raw, unfiltered agony that could no longer be contained. Her cries rose and fell in uneven waves, sometimes frantic, sometimes fading into thin, trembling whimpers that chilled the listeners even more. A servant hurried into the corridor, clutching her shawl around trembling shoulders. She paused, listening, and a look of terror washed over her face. It was not just the sound of pain she heard. It was the sound of a body fighting a battle it had already begun to lose. A battle no physician would enter. A battle no prayer had eased. The fortress reacted as if alive. Wooden beams groaned. Shadows shuddered along the walls. The very air seemed to tighten around her screams, trapping them within the stone, so they reverberated long after her voice quieted. Those who stood outside her door could do nothing. They were witnesses, not saviors, bound by orders stronger than compassion. And when her cries suddenly broke off, abrupt, strangled, replaced by a silence far more terrifying, the corridor seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the night to decide what it would take from her next. If this story shocks you, let Echoes of Time know in the comments. Your reactions help shape future episodes. What followed in the days after that night was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, relentless unraveling. An erosion felt in the very air around her. The fortress seemed to sense it before the attendants did. The halls grew colder. The shadows stretched deeper. Even the river below moved with a quieter, more hesitant rhythm, as if the world itself were bracing for a transformation it could not prevent. Inside her chamber, the queen lay still for long stretches of time, her breath shallow, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. But when she stirred, it was with a heaviness that had not been there before, a weariness carved into her bones. The attendants noticed how her hands trembled when she tried to rise, how her shoulders curled inward as if protecting something fragile, something failing. A faint pallor settled over her skin, dimming the remnants of vitality that had once defied the fortress walls. Her movements slowed to a fraction of what they had been. It was as though her body had begun to fold in on itself, surrendering pieces one by one. The scent in her chamber deepened, not instantly, not as a sudden intrusion, but gradually, growing stronger with each passing day. It lingered in the corners, clung to the linens, wove itself into the draft that slipped beneath the door. Servants entering with fresh water found themselves pausing, breath-catching, as the subtle but unmistakable odor of something turning, something breaking down, crept into their senses. They said nothing aloud, but their eyes spoke the truth they feared to voice. Her illness no longer felt like an ailment of the mind or spirit, no longer something that could be soothed by rest or prayer. It had entered the body more deeply now, claiming territory beyond sight, altering her strength, her voice, her very presence. At times she pressed her palm to her abdomen or her side, as though trying to quiet a fire burning just beneath the surface. Other times she clutched the blankets with white-knuckled desperation, trying to steady herself against waves of pain that left her breathless. Each movement told a story her attendants were forbidden to ask about. As the days drew on, the fortress itself seemed to recoil. Doors creaked without wind. Torches sputtered as though resisting the air they burned. Even the guards found reasons to stand farther from her door, shifting their posts with uneasy glances. It was no longer just suffering. It was a transformation. A slow, silent descent that felt unnatural in its persistence, as if her body had begun to turn inward, collapsing from forces neither physician nor priest could name. And through it all, she remained conscious enough to feel the tide rising within her, to sense the betrayal of her own flesh, to know that whatever was happening was not something she would return from. Her body was failing, and doing so in a way that no one around her had the courage to confront. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Echoes of Time so you never miss our next deep dive into forgotten history. As winter crept closer, time inside Tordesillas began to lose its shape. Days bled into nights without distinction, marked only by the quiet shifting of guards outside her door or the muted clatter of a tray left at the threshold. The world beyond the fortress still turned, still breathed, still lived. But here, inside these suffocating walls, everything orbited a single failing life. The queen no longer walked the small perimeter of her chamber. Her strength, once stubborn, resilient, had dwindled to something fragile and flickering. She spent long hours reclining against the thin pillows, her gaze drifting somewhere far beyond the dim room, as though she saw things the attendants could not. Memories, visions, perhaps a life she longed to return to, or one she wished she had never known. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to be mistaken for wind stirring through old tapestries. She spoke in fragments, names, prayers, questions with no answers. Sometimes she whispered to the window shutters as though the world outside might still hear her. Other times she reached out with trembling fingers, not toward anything physical, but toward the idea of escape. A gesture stopped short by years of isolation. Those who cared for her sensed a deep shift. She resisted the cold now only with a thin shawl. She accepted water without lifting her eyes. Her breath, once ragged with pain, grew slow, too spaced, as if her body were reluctantly loosening its hold on the world. The fortress responded like a living thing. The stones seemed heavier, the corridors quieter. Even the river's constant murmur softened, as though out of respect or fear. Servants walked with bowed heads, each step carrying the quiet knowledge that the queen's suffering was approaching its end, though none could say how many days or hours remained. Her son did not come. He sent no physician, no priest, no comforting word. To the outside world, she was already gone. A name whispered in political circles, a figure confined to footnotes, a burden placed neatly out of sight. But inside this single room, she still breathed, still fought, still held on with what little remained of her fading will. And as her strength ebbed further, the atmosphere within Tordesillas shifted once more. Not a sharp change, but a subtle tightening, like the drawing of a final curtain. The attendants felt it. The guards sensed it. Even the cold seemed to gather around her bed, waiting. The end had not yet come, but it had begun. When the final days of her suffering slipped quietly into memory, the fortress did not celebrate, nor did it mourn. It simply exhaled, the long, weary breath of a place that had held too many secrets for too many years. Her chamber fell silent. The torches burned steadily again. The corridors lost the tension that had lived beneath their stones. But even in her absence, the weight of her story did not lift. Those who had watched over her spoke in hushed voices, not out of loyalty, but out of reverence for the strange, sorrowful power she had carried to the end. She had not commanded armies. She had not delivered speeches. Her throne had been taken from her long before illness ever touched her. Yet she lingered in the minds of everyone who crossed those halls. A quiet shape carved into the memory of Tordesillas itself. Outside the fortress, the world continued to move with its usual indifference. Scrolls were written. Decisions were made. Her name, if mentioned at all, was spoken as though she had been little more than a troubled footnote in a vast and glittering dynasty. The narrative of her life became distorted, softened or sharpened depending on who told it, until truth dissolved into rumor and rumor into myth. But within these walls, the truth felt different. Here, she was not the caricature history attempted to shape. Not a woman dismissed. Not a mind exaggerated. Not a queen forgotten. Within Tordesillas, she was something else entirely. A presence felt in the stillness. A sorrow etched into stone. A question that lingered long after her final breath. What would her life have been, had the world allowed her to keep it? Her legacy was not one of madness or weakness, but of endurance. A silent endurance that spanned years of confinement, isolation, and betrayal. An endurance that revealed the quiet, devastating truth of power misused. She became, in her suffering, a mirror held up to the ambitions around her, and a warning history chose not to heed. And though her story faded from the songs of courts and chronicles, it settled instead into the deeper soil of memory, waiting for someone, someday, to unearth it again, to listen, to look closer, to tell it without distortion. Tonight, in the dim corridors of Tordesillas, her absence seems almost as vivid as her presence once was. And if one listens closely, the walls still hold a faint echo, not of suffering, but of a life whose meaning stretches far beyond the confines of a fortress. If the story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and tell Echoes of Time where you're watching from. Your voice keeps forgotten history alive.